Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending. We're going to give it a couple more minutes before we begin. Okay. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. We will get started. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We're excited to have you here for the discussion on safeguarding identity security. We need to talk about MFA. In today's session, we'll be diving into the Osterman research, share insights, and explore strategies to strengthen and simplify your MFA, and why a layered authentication should be a priority. Afterwards, we'll have some time for Q&A. We have Josh Parsons and Michael Sampson here to share their thoughts, and we encourage you to ask questions. With that said, Josh, if you'd like to start and introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. And like Kim said, I'm Josh Parsons. I'm the product manager at Zoic, and my role gives me a front row seat to the challenges that organizations are facing in protecting identities and preventing account takeover, which is what we'll be diving into today. And it's my pleasure to introduce Michael, who will be sharing his expertise and research with us. So, Michael, over to you.
Thanks, Josh. It's great to be here today. So thanks for having me. I'm Michael Sampson, Principal Analyst at Osterman Research, and I've been working at Osterman since around 2008 and have been in the Principal Analyst role for the past couple of years. For those of you not familiar with Osterman Research, we're a market research company focused on delivering insightful research for technology vendors that impacts customers. And the research that Josh and I will be speaking about today is one that Osterman collaborated with in Zoyacon last year called Safeguarding Identity Security. We need to talk about MFA. Josh, perhaps if I just start by talking about the methodology that we followed in gathering the data, and then we can start into the key points. Does that sound like a good plan?
Yeah, sounds like a plan.
Let's do this. We ran a survey in the United States of 126 identity, IAM, and cybersecurity leaders that have direct responsibility for identity security in their organizations. Given the topic, we were interested to get an understanding of how organizations were responding to the increase in attacks that were bypassing MFA and the sorts of things that they were doing in order to strengthen the protections that they have around identity. We focused on organizations that had at least 500 employees, and across the 126 respondents, the average firm size was just under 3,500. We were also interested in a cross and multi-industry viewpoint on this topic, and therefore there were no industry restrictions or exclusions. One of the key findings, or one of the initial findings that I think would be a good place to start, is that identity security is very much under attack. When we ran the survey, we asked a series of questions around types of identity cyber attacks in the previous 12 months, the current status in terms of protecting employees and applications with MFA, the reliance on various forms of MFA, and also what organizations had seen in terms of the changing threat environment over the past 12 months in terms of cyber criminals unleashing identity attacks on their organization. As you can see from these numbers, they're all fairly high. So 79% of respondents said they had been compromised by one or more types, not incidents or breaches, but types of identity cyber attacks in the previous 12 months. 94.2% of respondents do not protect every employee and every app with MFA. 99.2% of organizations continue to have some degree of reliance on MFA approaches that use one-time codes that can be easily phished, whether that is an SMS-based delivery of a one-time code, or an email-based delivery, or even an authenticator app that uses a one-time code that the user types into their screen in response to a request. And finally, 85.7% of respondents said that they had seen cyber criminals becoming more interested in stealing and abusing compromised credentials over the past 12 months. And for this finding, we definitely see that it echoes some of the other research that has been done across the industry that says this is a threat vector of increasing interest to cyber criminals, and therefore organizations need to pay increasing attention to it. We asked how the respondents were aware that identity security was becoming more difficult for them, or what the drivers were in terms of what was happening. There were a mix of factors that ranked fairly highly. In first place was the growing IT complexity at organizations, and that yellow bar is the extremely impactful rating in the survey, which was the highest one. And you can see that we've got 57.1% of respondents saying that this was the highest rated issue for them across the 6 that we asked about. When we add in the very impactful, you get 83.3%. In second place was an external factor, where the threat landscape is becoming more dangerous. And this is something that is outside of the control of organizations. Cyber criminals are more interested, more active, more pernicious in trying to gain surreptitious access through compromise of identities. Josh, I've talked about a couple of the data points here. Is there anything that you'd like to amplify or extend at this point, or should I keep going?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that we're seeing that most organizations don't protect every employee with MFA, and the MFA that organizations are using is typically not the most secure form of MFA. It uses one-time codes, which we know can be easily phished or cracked. And at the same time, we're seeing that attackers are becoming more interested in leveraging compromised credentials. And like you mentioned, this matches other industry research. And we've seen in 2024, there's been, for example, like a Snowflake customer data breach and the Change Healthcare ransomware attack. And those were both found to have compromised credentials as the initial attack vector. So what we found in this survey matches the market quite closely.
Yes, thank you, Josh. We asked around the sense of how respondents' new identity threats were changing over the previous 12 months. It's one thing for a respondent to say in response to a question, oh yes, things are changing, it's getting worse, but we wanted to try and understand what was being seen across the survey respondents and the organizations that we were interviewing for this. In the two top spots in terms of reasons, we've experienced an increase in account takeover attempts at our organization, with 55% of respondents saying, yes, that's us. And then in second place, fairly close behind at 48.4, respondents said we've detected an increase in credential phishing attacks at our organization. Now, these are direct experience items, and while this slide doesn't present good news, I think it's the right way for the data to come through, which is organizations are seeing a direct impact and therefore are highly aware that they need to do something about it, as opposed to only reading about it in media coverage. Josh has already talked about the series of breaches that happened as a result of the Snowflake compromise, as well as the Change Healthcare one. It's one thing to read about those case studies, it's another thing to experience it directly. And so there's both direct experience as well as some indirect experience or exposure to the topic as a result of what's happening to other organizations. Now we're going to go to the next section, but before we do, Josh, anything final on what we've talked about here?
Yeah, some other industry research. So the Verizon DBIR report and the IBM
Cool.
cost of a data breach report both found that compromised credentials are the top cause of a data breach. So a lot of organizations are feeling it. We see here most organizations are experiencing an increase in ATO, account takeover attempts at their organization. It's just the easiest way for attackers to get an initial foothold in your environment. So when security teams think that they have, for example, a ransomware problem or something like that, what they should really think about is how can we secure our authentication, make sure our credentials are secure to stop that initial kind of intrusion into our environment that leads to so much damage and having escalated privileges and things like that. So, Michael, let's hear about some of the dynamics that go into detecting and stopping attackers from using these compromised credentials.
Thank you. Yes, I'll do that. I just also want to piggyback on your comment around that IBM cost of a data breach report. There was a separate report that IBM came out with last year called Identity Comes Under Attack, Straining Enterprises' Recovery Time from Breaches. And one of the comments that they make in that is that in comparison to phishing-based attacks, identity-based attacks had increased to be equivalent or slightly ahead of what was happening with phishing. So yes, IBM's put out some good data in recent times around this. Let's keep going. So detecting and mitigating the use of invalid credentials is a fairly significant and important test of the efficacy of an identity security posture for an organization. We asked respondents in the survey if they were able to stop identity attacks in real time, and you can see here that 26.2% said that yes, we can do that, and therefore we can prevent the attack from succeeding. What that means, however, is that 73.8% of respondents are not able to stop it in real time, which means that the door is open for data theft, data corruption, and various forms of loss, including reputational and financial. Now, Josh, I don't like the 73.8% number here. When I look at it, I guess the best thing that you can say about it is at least the bars present in the ways they do rather than the opposite. at least 46% are saying as soon as the attack has succeeded, as opposed to 46% saying we don't feel confident that we could stop these types of attacks once they have occurred. Again, being in this red box is not a place that any organization should be in. And so for those that find themselves in the 46%, there is some added investment and work required in order to step up protections and try to get to this the teal box, add into the teal box where you can detect it in real time and therefore prevent the attack from succeeding at all. Is there anything you want to add to this one, Josh?
Yeah, I think being in the teal box is the easiest box to be in because if you can stop the attack before they're in your environment, you're blocking the attacker instead of chasing the attacker. So I think it's very concerning, not just from a security standpoint, but when you think about all of the work those security teams have to do to be able to detect an attacker in their environment after it's succeeded and then remediate the damage and consider any data that's been exfiltrated or anything else like that. It really makes sense to invest in prevention rather than detection.
Josh, what I really like about what you just said is that being in the teal box does require some upfront investment in process and technology and upskilling of cybersecurity professionals in order to make sure this stuff is working. But as you said, once you're in that teal box, then there's a whole set and suite and flow of negative consequences and costs and a whole range of bad stuff that an organization avoids that would be more costly, significantly more costly, perhaps orders of magnitude more costly than making the investment upfront to be in the teal box. I think it's a really good way of talking about it. Thank you. We asked respondents around their confidence to be able to detect in real time these types of things. And you can see that confidence is declining over time for around half of the respondents. When we looked at the data, confidence was increasing over time for 44%. And what was interesting in that is that the underlying data was similar between the two different cohorts that said confidence is declining and confidence is increasing. And it's unclear to me if the respondent doesn't do anything different around their identity posture, which is what this question was predicated on, that those respondents would say that confidence increases over time. And perhaps that's a blind hope that cyber threat actors will pivot to different types of attacks or something else. I don't know. From a research perspective, if you're not upgrading what you're doing or strengthening what you're doing, I think that that teal bar there around confidence declining would be much, much higher than is represented. But this is what the data says. Any thoughts from you, Josh?
Yeah, I think confidence could be declining with a lot of folks and a lot of security teams because as soon as they take steps to, for example, implement MFA, so let's say they start out with something like SMS or email-based MFA, they implement that, and then a year later they read that it's no longer secure. They need to have authentication app-based MFA. Then they implement that, and then they hear that's no longer secure. They need biometrics, and that might be very costly and inaccessible to a lot of folks. So it seems like the bar keeps moving. So as soon as people take steps to secure their environment, there's all of a sudden new goals that they have to reach. So I can
Right.
definitely see why confidence would be declining for a lot of folks because the target just keeps moving.
Okay. Thank you. Let's have a look what's on the next slide. We asked around the ability to detect cyber attacks with MFA bypass and how they would be able to do that. Just under half said that the authentication request would be treated as invalid and access denied in real time. 46% said they would receive an alert that an anomalous authentication request had been approved. And then there's some other ones that are showing here. If we put the inverse results up for this ability, then 50.8% can't detect and stop an authentication request in real time. 54% don't have alerting capabilities. 61% can't rely on their SIM. 69% are not tracking the dark web for early indications of compromised credentials that could then be leveraged by a threat actor in an identity-based attack. 70.6% can't rely on their CASB in order to flag anomalous activity around identity, such as impossible travel patterns and so on. So, there's a set of tools and technologies that are available in the market that security and identity teams can embrace to strengthen their protections against MFA bypass. It seems from our read of the industry out of this research that between one half and almost and slightly over 2 out of 3 don't have the right capabilities in place in order to be able to do this. Anything jump out to you on this one, Josh?
Yeah, you asked some very smart questions in this survey. And I think the takeaway and what we're seeing on this slide here is more and more security teams are seeing kind of MFA bypass becoming an issue. And I think it's because MFA bypass is so prone to user error, such as phishing, MFA bombing attacks. It all comes down to the user having secure practices and the knowledge to be able to use MFA correctly. And as security teams know, the human is usually the weakest link. So if we're relying on our users to secure our accounts, it's maybe not the best strategy. And I think we've seen, Michael, that organizations don't have the utmost confidence in MFA and can't detect an MFA bypass. Do you think that there is an appetite for a stronger and more secure MFA among security teams?
Josh, I think that's a great question, and we've sort of focused on the negative aspects of where organizations are at today, or the current state of the industry, which isn't as good as we would want it to be. When we asked respondents around the reasons that they would have for using and strengthening MFA, then there's a whole set of reasons that were all very highly rated. You can see here that there was among 73.9%, again, this is the highest of the ratings in the survey, saying that their key reason for using MFA would be to reduce the likelihood of account takeover. Then in second place, you've got to increase the likelihood of securing cyber insurance coverage or to reduce premium rates. And we've definitely seen a move in the industry among insurers to tie posture to likelihood of extending coverage, as well as the scale and scope of what those premiums are going to be. And insurers are looking for evidence that the controls that are in place are as good as they can be in order to enable the organization to protect itself. There's very much a changing risk calculus. You can't just rely on insurance anymore. If you can get it, you have to have strong protections within your organization. What's interesting from a researcher perspective when I look at this is that there's very little variation across the 8 reasons that we asked about, from reducing the likelihood of a network intrusion to reducing the likelihood of data phishing, data breaches, and ransomware attacks, to the last one here, to meet compliance requirements in our industry. There's very little variation from the lowest ranked to the top ranked. And when I dived into the data, 90% of respondents ranked 6 or more of these reasons as being highly important to them. So yes, I do think there is some appetite Um, and I see in the data some movement toward this. It's just not as fast as I would have liked to have seen it. When I look at these reasons, I mean, one of the comments that I would make based on what we've covered in the earlier slides in our time together today is that using anything but the strongest MFA methods that make sense for your organization is a recipe for disaster. And that would include things like insurance being cancelled, a network intrusion, class action lawsuit, data breach, and so on. We do see a move towards more modern MFA methods. And in the data, we asked what the posture was 2 years ago, currently, and where the respondent believed their organization would be in 2 years' time. And the most common pattern across them is that there was a transition to more modern approaches that were non-phishable or definitely less phishable than legacy MFA methods. You can see that the increased use of legacy MFA methods is also increasing by 28%. And, at one level that's worrisome. Within the pattern, however, there was a move away from SMS-based delivery of codes and email-based delivery of codes with an increased use of authenticators. And I like that movement away from SMS and email toward authenticators. And I think that, within the authenticators pattern, there is a variety of approaches from just entering a 6-digit code to responding to a prompt with a yes or no, to typing in a couple of digits that match what's shown on the screen. There's some innovation going on in here, and even within that pattern, there are better and worse approaches to dealing with MFA. Right. Any comments from you before we go to the next section?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that a number of folks are kind of doubling down on legacy MFA methods or trialed the newer MFA methods and then reverted to the older ones. I think it
Yes.
just speaks to so many environments may have legacy applications or just don't have the organizational buy-in at every level to realistically implement these more modern forms of MFA, which are a large project to implement, are more secure, but it is a balance between usability, cost, and what works for each individual organization.
Thank you. Yes. And if your choice is to use nothing versus using SMS, then by all means use SMS. Having something in place is better than having nothing in place. And if that's the first step that you take towards moving towards strengthening your identity posture in your organization, then go for it. Get it done. I would like to see more of a movement over the next few years towards these stronger forms of modern MFA methods that are not susceptible to MFA bypass, that are not susceptible to phishing, that protect the user, the data, the applications, and the organizations from the negative consequences that we've touched on so far.
Great. And I think, Michael, we've talked a lot about MFA methods, and MFA is so important. But I think MFA fits into a larger picture here because security isn't just one tool, it's about having multiple layers, with MFA being one of the layers. So we can take a look here at some of the other layers security teams should look at. And first on the list here, we have anomaly detection. And security teams can increasingly capture identity signals to establish something of like a baseline normal behavior for either a user or a subset. So if one user suddenly begins, accessing systems at odd hours or from unusual locations, it can raise a red flag. And the trade-off here is that you can get a lot of false positives. So to do this well, you probably need something like a 24/7 SOC team that has humans looking at the alerts and can make decisions on them. Because I know, personally on Saturday nights, I'm not too exciting. I might have my work laptop open, writing a blog or something like that. So, you know, anomaly detection would probably pick up on that, where they would think, could be an attacker in another country, whereas it's just me actually working. So this is a good strategy, but have to make sure that you have human input in it. Otherwise, it could be frustrating for your users. And that leads us on to the next one here. So new form factors for MFA hardware devices. And more than 95% of solutions now support next-gen MFA. And these could look like hardware keys with built-in biometric sensors, or maybe FIDO MFA. However, like I mentioned before, there is the cost consideration, and the probability of complications resulting from these can be relatively high. Hardware keys can be lost and take time to either manually grant access or replace those keys. And they tend to get lost at the worst times. So, like when an executive is on a business trip and they have an important meeting, they need their PowerPoint and they don't have their key, it's probably going to be the security team that's going to be blamed, because the blame usually falls on us for some reason. And biometrics can be a similar story. They're prone to failure. For example, if someone's fingerprint changes, maybe they bought an oven mitt off of Temu and now their biometric no longer works. So that can increase help desk load, and you have to take that into account when implementing these. And we're about to talk about what I think is maybe the most direct and actionable intelligence you can introduce into securing your authentication. And this is talking about visibility into identity threats, and ideally having that visibility correlating with automated remediation so that there's no window of exposure. Problems are detected and things like anomalous behaviors are able to be remediated quickly. And this brings me into what I think is one of the most fundamental forms of this visibility. And this is early warning of compromised credentials. So when you're asking, what should I have visibility into? To put it directly, compromised credentials are your top risk, with so much research showing that this is the top entry point for attackers. And this is arguably the most fundamental piece of the puzzle. It's like, it's 2025. We need to have secure passwords. Passwords are the walls around your authentication. So even if every other layer of identity security you have is strong and impenetrable and will stop anything, you're still making your organization a target if you're not actively scanning for and remediating these compromised credentials. Because if you think about it, once attackers know a password to one of your user accounts, are able to test and see it's a legitimate, correct password, they're going to use all of their resources to try and get past those other layers. So even if the other layers do stop the attackers, it's going to create a lot of unnecessary load on your security teams. And I can guarantee almost everyone, potentially everyone in the audience, probably has compromised credentials in your environment right now, unless you are monitoring for and remediating them currently. And I think it's worth a conversation on how this is happening. And this slide here maps out the typical chain reaction that follows compromised credentials. It's from password reuse. And there have been so many studies at this point that show over 80% of users reuse their passwords across multiple websites. And there's absolutely no question that any password that your users are able to set or interact with is more than likely being reused, not just across, corporate and professional websites, but probably across personal websites as well. And there's no question that some of those websites are probably not very secure. They store passwords in plain text, and those websites can be compromised. And that's how those passwords become compromised on the dark web. And even if you're using something like a password manager, that can be a good practice, but it is putting all of your eggs in one basket because that master password is probably being reused insofar as your users have control over it. So that risk is essentially being shared with every other website that that password is being reused on. And as soon as an attacker can log in and open a session, they can immediately exfiltrate data, launch ransomware, move laterally, persist in your environment, and set up backdoors. And this can have a substantial cost to your organization. So we want to stop this at the source. And what's an easy way that we can do that? Here's how Enzoic helps you prevent breaches. So we know that there are data breaches every day, and a lot of them we hear about. Some are from like Fortune 500s that will probably make the news, but some, like a local school system or maybe a niche website, might might not even hit the news, may not even make local news. And what's common among all of these breaches is the contents of the breach will likely end up on the dark web. And those breached passwords and breached credentials, the cloud we see there, represents a culmination of data breaches that commonly appear on the dark web. And what we do at Enzoic is we capture those data breaches that appear at every level of the dark web, the deep web, the surface net. And we have automated tools combined with a strong threat research team to be able to capture compromised data at the earliest possible time, even before the attackers can get access to it. And we provide this data to you and have pre-built solutions to make the entire process of securing passwords and making sure that no passwords in your environment are compromised. We make it automated, so it's very much set and forget. And how does this actually look and feel in your environment if you were to deploy Enzoic? Well, we can deploy into any login flow that you have development access into. You can essentially place our APIs there, and we have options for it being self-serve depending on your implementation. We have public developer docs so you can see how it works. And we also have a pre-built solution for Active Directory that not only lets you scan for compromised passwords or compromised credentials with automated remediation, but also gives you very granular controls over your password policies. So if this is something that you're looking into and you have a use case in mind, we're more than likely able to accommodate that use case. And let's highlight a few of the key advantages that Enzoic brings to the table. First, there's the enhanced security you get by pairing Enzoic with MFA. So you're securing the passwords, which are the base of your authentication, along with the added layer of protection of MFA. So you're essentially getting true multi-factor authentication, where every authentication factor is secure. And second, Enzoic helps with compliance, whether you're aiming to meet NIST 863B guidelines, high trust standards, New York Department Financial Services, NCSC in the UK, or different state and federal regulations. This is a very common requirement to scan for compromised, commonly used passwords, and many organizations are starting to adopt this. The New York Department of Financial Services is one example. They introduced the requirement last year in 2024. And you also get this compliance and security benefit, and you also save time. It's a big uplift on user experience because you get to remove those disruptive time-based password resets, and the need for overly complex password policies. And the background on this is NIST, the organization that recommends you scan for compromised passwords to prevent users from setting compromised passwords, recommends you not have time-based password resets and instead monitor your passwords for compromise so that when a password becomes compromised, you can simply remediate that password. So what you're trading here is instead of every 30 days, 60 days, 6 months, resetting the passwords automatically, you can completely scrap that. Your users will love it. And instead, when one of those passwords become compromised, that's when you enforce a password reset. And this leads me into the last point here. There's a real reduction in administrative costs. So if we're ignoring that cost of a data breach and the nightmare that could be, just looking at how this can make your life easier on day one when you implement Zoic, you'll notice less burden on your help desk because there's automated remediation. It's a very small burden on your security teams. And in fact, you'll notice that it alleviates some of the burden because if you don't have time-based password resets, users are far more likely to remember their passwords. And this creates a very good experience, not just for your security teams, the security of your organization, but also for your users.
Josh, I think it's really interesting how the industry's moved from a recommendation around time-based password resets to not doing that. And from my point of view, part of the reason for that is that time-based password resets often made passwords less secure, because if you're having to change it every 30 days or every 60 or 90 days, then how does someone remember what their current password is? And we've seen instances where people would just append the month to the password that they had previously, or the year. And so you've got these patterns that if a threat actor is able to get something from 3 months ago, they can see perhaps the base of your password, and then that you've added a month to it, they can go, well, we know that that's not going to be current, but we will guess that actually the current one is that base with now February at the end rather than November, which is the one that we compromised. And so you've got this systemic weakness that flows across an organization under such things. What we're seeing in the industry now is just don't do that, but there's some other things that you do around keeping passwords secure. Thanks for stepping us through that.
Yeah, and I think it's natural that we round this out with some best practices here. And we have 4 pillars, with the most foundational ones first. You should be scanning for compromised credentials as a first line of defense. And then after you've done that, look towards more secure forms of MFA, and then having real-time insights into anomalous logins, and then keeping tabs on unusual user behavior. And I think the way I've ordered this here and we've worked together is these are in order from maybe the most simplest for security teams to implement to maybe the most mature security teams can really get more visibility into their environment, depending on how deep they would like to go in terms of measuring user metrics and acting on those security signals. And MFA should be strengthened in lockstep. So with more secure MFA, you have training your workforce, introducing new hardware, securing passwords, and rate limiting all play an important role here. And I'm really happy to see that security teams are recognizing that. And Michael, I'll go ahead and hand it back to you. Could you share your perspective on what threat actors are hoping will do wrong? What common mistakes do they count on us making?
Thanks, Josh. So, when I think about what we're seeing in the industry, what we're seeing from a threat perspective, what threat actors would love organizations to do is embrace the three ideas on this screen. Number one, keep using the weaker forms of MFA that are easily phishable. And the more that organizations do that, the more threat actors rub their hands in glee at the ease of being able to bypass um, any identity protections that you have in place. The second preferred playbook item that threat actors would love organizations to embrace is not worrying about visibility into identity security posture. So that's things like who does and doesn't have MFA enabled, which applications do and do not have MFA enabled, what type of MFA is being enabled on this, what type of anomalous threats or anomalous patterns are being generated as a result of activity within your organization and beyond it. If you're not worried about that, if you're not looking at that, again, threat actors are going, yeah, this is great. This is the type of organization we want to go after. And then finally, don't monitor to ensure that employee credentials are not compromised. The longer that they have access to compromised credentials before they are remediated, the happier threat actors are at their ability to surreptitiously get into your environment, get access to data and applications they shouldn't have access to, move laterally, plant ransomware, and do a whole lot of pernicious things in order to reap a financial reward as a result of that compromised credential. So yes, ladies and gentlemen, please do not embrace the playbook that threat actors want you to follow. It's time to do something different.
Great.
Now, Josh
Thank
and
you.
I have, sorry, Kim, just before you
No, yeah,
introduce Q&A, because I know that's next. Josh and I have talked about some of the highlights from the report that we did together last year, and I'd encourage you to get a copy of the full report from the Exoic website, and perhaps Kim will include that in some follow-up messages to you as well in terms of where you can get that. Kim, back to you.
thank you. Yes, Michael, you are correct. Thank you both. We've covered a lot of great insights, and now that brings us to the Q&A. So if you haven't already, please feel free to drop in some questions. We'll give it a few minutes. And as Michael mentioned, I will be doing a follow-up email to those that attended and those that fortunately missed the webinar. In there will be copies of the presentation as well as the report. And then if there's any questions, please feel free to follow up with Michael at Osterman or Josh at Inzoic. So let's hear. Let's start with at least the first question here. Michael, I'm going to let you take this one first, and then Josh, definitely feel free to step in if there's anything you want to add. Someone asked that your research suggests that many organizations still use weak MFA methods like SMS-based codes. Why do you think that companies are slow to adopt stronger MFA?
Kim, I think it's a question that could be answered on multiple levels, and this is something that's come up recently in other conversations I've had around this topic. Definitely there's a cost to strengthening processes in advance of a breach or an incident. And several years ago, when we were doing quite a bit of work around ransomware, it was inevitable that once someone had suffered a ransomware attack or a major data breach due to that, the press release from the organization would say something to the effect of, hey, this has happened to us. And then in the first paragraph, it would be, as a consequence, we are strengthening our identity protections and embracing MFA. And one of the comments that I made at the time was, why wait until we hit this place? It would be much better if we could, do this in advance of carrying the exponential order of magnitude higher cost as a result of this. The other thing that Josh has mentioned, and I fully agree with, is that some applications and legacy applications don't support modern identity flows, and there are ways of intercepting those identity flows and introducing more modern approaches. And then there's also the user education question around how do we encourage users to use more secure forms to protect themselves, the customers that they're working with, and us as an organization. So yeah, there's a variety of reasons for that. None of them are easy to answer, but it is something that organizations need to wrestle with as they look at their risks and what they're trying to do in the world.
Yeah, I think what you said, Michael, is completely correct. It comes down to resources, things like cost and time to implement. And I also think, from what I've seen in my subjective experience, it comes to organizational buy-in in the form of if you have more invasive forms of MFA, for example, biometrics or a hardware key, and usability has to be up to everyone's expectation, you may get pushback from a lot of unhappy users in the organization who simply don't like using those, or maybe they lose the key or the biometrics don't work one day. And what we've seen is a lot of folks who implement things like biometrics, a lot of users have problems. So those organizations will put a password or a PIN fallback. So if the biometric doesn't work, then the user can put in their password, which reintroduces the risk of passwords, but it makes the users happier. So yeah, I think it comes down to resources and also keeping users happy.
Great, thank you both. We have another question here, and Josh, I'm going to hand this off to you first. Is um, how does introducing dark web monitoring for compromised credentials affect the user experience?
Yeah, the answer is it doesn't, unless it improves it. So let me explain that. When your users log in a system that might have Zoic checking for compromised passwords or compromised credentials, your users are going to notice zero difference and no latency. The only way they would notice a difference is if you were to follow the recommendation from NIST, is to eliminate the time-based password resets. So when you scrap those, your users will certainly notice not having to change their passwords every, 3 months, 6 months, etc. But they won't notice when they're logging in if their password or full credential pair is compromised. Of course, unless it is compromised and they need to reset it, but that is certainly preferable from a user perspective, rather than the forced time-based resets. So that's my thoughts on that. Michael, what do you think?
Josh, the flow that you showed us for how you check for things, and actually let's just go back to that slide because I think it was helpful for us. Now, the flow that you're showing here is, there are things that are happening in the background. And if it's compromised, then there's a risk, then there's a mitigation of the risk or a blocking of the access so that then some remediation steps can happen as a consequence of that. If there's no compromise, then the user just, does what they would normally do. And the same thing here. If they're selecting a new password, it's one that has already been compromised before, or has been used before, or is commonly known, then the user is told, no, you can't use that one. It doesn't work for you. And so, to pick up on what you said, it improves it in a positive way. And with much of the stuff happening in the background, the user shouldn't know that it's even there until something bad has happened and they need to be able to strengthen what they're doing.
Yeah,
Great,
that is completely correct.
thank you. Great answers. And I'll just take one more here. And if I haven't gotten to your questions, we'll answer it via email. The last question, Michael, I'll start with you is, looking at the data from your research, where do you see identity security evolving in the next few years? I'd love to kind of get your understanding based on obviously the research and other research that you've looked at, and Josh, for you, kind of from what you've seen on the Zoic side.
Kim, I think this is still a very fluid space, and there's quite a lot of interesting activity going on the vendor side at looking at how do we strengthen this stuff for organizations. I'm really interested to see how things move over the next 18 months from the vendor side. From the organizational side, which was the focus of this research, I would like to see some of the numbers that we've talked about earlier on in this presentation being strengthened. The move to more modern approaches, for example, was only 61%. I'd like to see that increase. The embrace of legacy MFA approaches, I'd like to see that decrease significantly. The movement to having more employees and more applications involved and enrolled using MFA, I'd like to see that continue to strengthen as well. I was involved in a call last week with some identity security leaders from a number of large organizations in the US, and one of the comments that they made is that MFA is a stepping stone towards passwordless passkeys and some of the newer forms of identity. And I guess that's still a space that needs some more research, needs some more understanding in terms of how organizations are approaching that. So very fluid. I hope to see some strengthening in core numbers, and I hope to see some improvement in overall posture.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, there is going to be a focus on stronger passwords. We've seen that the New York Department of Financial Services just introduced a requirement to monitor for commonly used passwords, and they introduced that just in 2024. The CMMC began requiring checks for compromised passwords, and that has a very strong likelihood of being required in future DoD contracts. So I think the stronger passwords component is going to become increasingly important. I think we will hear more about things like passwordless, but I think adoption of that will just be quite slow. It's a technology that's existed since the 90s. Even Windows 2000, that OS had the option for smart cards, but adoption was quite low then. It's a little bit higher now, but just not a great fit for most organizations yet until it becomes a more mature technology. So for the time being and for the foreseeable future, folks are going to have passwords in their environment, and making sure that those passwords aren't compromised, are secure, and are also paired with a secure form of MFA will all help keep those accounts secure.
Great. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Michael. Really, it's been great having you both speak to us today around MFA. I hope everyone was able to gain some valuable insights. And if you'd like to connect, please reach out to Michael or Josh with any additional questions. Please keep an eye out. I'll be sending out an email with the recording slides and the report as well. Thank you all for your time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Kim.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks, Kim.